continue with the question, the long question. Well, ultimately we're going to continue with the long question. We need to, before we talk about the liquidity trap, firstly we need to clarify our understanding of where money demand comes from. So ultimately we're going to do, find the question. We're going to do 10 part B. Explain what it means for an economy to be in a liquidity trap. What effect does that have on the LM curve? Before we can do that, we need to settle the question as to what money demand, how money demand behaves when interest rates get close to zero. Because most of what you said in your answers about what the liquidity trap is, they were kind of hopelessly vague. They were not at all precise. You really need to be more precise. So, before we talk about the liquidity trap at all, let's just straighten out where money demand comes from, what happens when interest rates get close to zero. Money demand. So let me draw the money market, or the demand side of the money market. So on the vertical axis we have an interest rate, and it's going to be the nominal interest rate. Later on in the long question, we're going to distinguish between real and nominal interest rates. So I want to try to persuade you why you should have to use the nominal interest rate. That is the interest rate on bonds, specifying how much extra you'll get as a saver in terms of extra money if you, say, buy $100 of bonds, where you get $105 at 5% interest, or $102, 2% interest. In a year's time. So not correcting that interest rate for inflation. Nominal interest rate. Later on we're going to have a real interest rate that corrects for inflation. So I want to persuade you why that's the appropriate interest rate to think about when talking about the money market. The quantity variable in the money market, hopefully I'll have less work to do to persuade you why we should look at real money balances, not nominal money balance, or at least we can do it in terms of real money balances. So then I'm going to draw money demand function that looks like this. In general, we're going to think of this as being a function L for liquidity, of real output, Y, and this nominal interest rate, I. So I want to justify why money demand looks like this. In particular, I want to justify what's going on as the interest rate is getting closer and closer to zero, where as I draw the money demand, it's kind of bending away from the horizontal axis. It's reluctant to sort of hit the axis and certainly to go beyond it. So we want to understand this demand function, what it represents, what its behavior is close to zero. Okay, so why do people hold money? What are the reasons that we say people might hold money? So to make transactions. Technically, you could call that the medium of exchange, role of money. You want to make transactions. So money can do this. So you go to a shop, you want to buy something, you hand over some money. This is obvious. What is actually important, though, is why you can do this with money, but not other kinds of assets. Crucially, what I'm saying here is not that you can spend money because you're wealthy. You can spend money because you've got money in your wallet. So I'm not talking here about wealth. I'm not talking about your ability to spend in terms of having the wealth or the income that would allow you to spend. I'm talking about simply the process of making the transaction, going into the shop, spending, giving the shopkeeper something he's willing to accept in order to give you goods and services in return. To see why it's important, imagine you were a very rich man or woman. You've got millions of dollars in the bank, but you go out one day and you've forgotten your wallet. And you're passing a car showroom and you see a particularly nice car that you'd like to buy. And you go in and say, I'd like to buy that car, but I forgot my wallet. I left it at home. Will you sell this car to me? I'm a wealthy man. I'll write you an IOU for the car. Just give me this IOU later on and I'll pay you for it. If you were running a car showroom, would you sell a car in that circumstance? Probably not, because your boss will sack you later on when you've got a piece of paper saying, I promise to pay $200,000 for this sports car. You have to go and find this person, and he's disappeared, never to be seen again. So money doesn't have that problem. Once the shopkeeper has got hold of the money, it won't be cash in this example probably, but paying with some kind of bank card, credit card, or a debit card, and the money will be transferred from the bank account to the shop. The point is, money can do this. Other assets, simply owning other assets, doesn't automatically give you spending power. You've got to have your wealth in a form that's acceptable to other people. You can actually strengthen my argument by saying, suppose this rich man, instead of forgetting his wallet, suppose he brought with him some government bonds or some shares. Brought the share certificates or the bonds with him. Doesn't have his wallet. He has some of his wealth, his financial wealth with him. So he says, I'll buy the car, but I don't want to give you cash. I don't want to pay with a credit card. Will you take these shares instead? Now there you might find an enterprising shopkeeper might be willing to accept those shares, especially if it's a small businessman. He might be able to check on the internet what the shares are worth. He really wants to make a sale, so he goes to the trouble of finding out what the shares are worth. Maybe he'll accept it. But if you're working for someone else and you start accepting shares rather than cash in terms of payment, you might get sacked. You're not following the correct procedure. The idea is that people go to the shop, they pay with money, they don't try to pay with other kinds of assets. Why exactly that is beyond the scope of this course, but you can kind of see some of the practical problems that would be involved in taking payments in other forms. We think of money as being a medium of exchange. It's the form of wealth that's immediately accepted for all kinds of transactions. So the key point is money can do this. Other assets either don't do it as well or can't do it at all. Let's just assume, to keep it simple, that money is the only asset that you can just go out and spend, in the sense of using it to pay for things directly. Of course, other assets, you can convert them into money and then use the purchasing power. You can't use them directly. You need money as the asset that's used to intermediate mediate these transactions. That's what medium of exchange means. Now, what are the other functions of money? What else does it do? It's a store of value, good. That was the other one I was looking for. There are several, actually, but only two of them are really relevant here. These are the two I need. Medium of exchange and number 2, store of value. So what does store of value mean? It means that money, like any asset, is a way of transferring wealth from one point in time to another. Money can do this. The question is, though, does it do it as well as other assets? So all we mean by the store of wealth is that you hold your wealth, you don't spend it, and you want to be able to use it in the future. So how well does money store value compared to other assets? What other assets are we talking about? What's typically used as the other asset apart from money in macroeconomics? Bonds. So as an example of something that you couldn't use as a medium of exchange before, you might have used bonds. It's not so easy to go out and directly spend government bonds in shops. If we compare money and bonds, which is the better store of value? Bonds are arguably superior to money as a store of value. So bonds store value better. Why is that? Because they're going to pay interest. So you're always going to earn some interest when you hold your wealth as bonds, but money doesn't pay interest. So it still preserves some value, but it doesn't do it as well as a financial asset that pays interest. So assets that pay some interest or pay some return will always do better in preserving and growing your wealth than assets that don't pay any return. Now, you could add other things to the list of why people might use money. I'm not going to get into that. Let's just think about these two things here. You can see there's a trade-off. Money does one thing better than bonds, but it's worse on the other count. So money demand is a trade-off between these two things. On the one hand, you can use it to spend. You can't use bonds to go out and spend directly. But on the other hand, bonds will beat money as a store of value. The money demand function represents that trade-off. So can we be more precise about what's the advantage of holding bonds over money? What's the difference between the return you get on bonds and the return you get on money? So you can say, what's the return on bonds minus the return on money? So there's two ways of doing that calculation. They deliver the same answer, though. The nominal interest rate on bonds is I. the nominal return on money is what? Is zero. $10 as cash turns into $10 of cash. It's never going to be anything other than $10, so long as it's kept as cash. Bonds, on the other hand, will turn $100 into $110 if the interest rate is 10%. Now that's a comparison in nominal terms. Suppose we did the comparison in real terms. Suppose we looked at the real interest rate. What's the real return on money? It's related to inflation, but it's not inflation itself, it's the negative of inflation. Basically, higher inflation lowers the real return on money. Strictly, it should be expected inflation, because trying to think about what return you anticipate getting. So minus the return, real return on money. That's in the brackets there. If inflation is expected to be 2%, you expect to get a negative 2% real return on money. So what do we conclude is the difference between the return on bonds and the return on money? Well, whichever way you think about it, it's going to be the nominal interest rate, because as we're going to see, which I'll cover after the lunch break, this final part of the equation, via the Fisher equation, is equal to the nominal interest rate. So however you look at this, the difference in return, not the return, the difference in the return between bonds and money is always the nominal interest rate. That's why the use of the nominal interest rate is the appropriate one to think about in the money market. Okay, so let me just test you on this with another short question.